We have these protagonists, immunoglobulins, the innate immune system, and the adaptive immune system. But what else do we need, or who else plays an important role within this mucosal immune system? Well, it is essential that there is training. And how is our mucosal immune system trained? Well, our immune system is trained through the continuous interaction between intestinal bacteria and the host, which are key to this competent immune system. Because this is where all these phenomena take place that we are talking about regarding antigen recognition, which we need to distinguish between those that are potentially pathogenic and those that are not, so that an immune reaction does not occur if we do not need it and does not become the trigger for inflammation. And then they start to enter. Once that inflammatory trigger has been activated through other protagonists, which are the pro-inflammatory mediators and intestinal permeability. Well, that interaction between the host and the bacteria that will be responsible for that immunotolerance, that immunological competition, fundamentally involves three elements: the polysaccharide A of Bacteroides fragilis, and then importantly, Enterococcus and Escherichia coli and Enterococcus faecalis are immunomodulatory bacteria that are the main protagonists of immunomodulation, which will produce or induce that antigenic tolerance, also stimulating the production of IgE, and which are, and this is important, non-inflammatory immunostimulants. Non-inflammatory. We said that we had the polysaccharide A of Bacteroides fragilis, but at the same time we had Enterococcus faecalis and Escherichia coli, both participating. If you notice, I have made this comparative table for you to see what the functions of each one are, although it is true that one plays a bigger role than the other in certain aspects. For example, both will participate in that phenomenon of antigenic tolerance. While it is true that Enterococcus faecalis will have a somewhat more prominent role, the production of immunoglobulin A will be more dependent on Enterococcus than on E. coli. I am not saying that E. coli does not contribute, just that perhaps it is a bit less. The modulation of the degranulation of these mast cells, which we have seen can participate in the maintenance and chronicity of the inflammatory response, will be more in favor of E. coli, and both, although they are immunostimulants, are not inflammatory. Non-pathogenic strains of E. coli have more of this power. On the other hand, Enterococcus faecalis is capable of acidifying the medium and thus neutralizing alkaline metabolites that will act as irritants within the microbiota of the intestinal mucosa, chronicling that chronic inflammatory stimulus. Immunoregulation of Enterococcus and E. coli, but there are other microorganisms. Despite the large number of microorganisms we have programmed, the reality is that today there is a small selection which have therapeutic importance. On one hand, the bacteria we have mentioned, but on the other hand, we have the non-coliforms, and on the other hand, we also have lactic bacteria. And with this, we refer mainly to Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus, because they are the groups with the most work experience and are also the predominant species in the Zweitausendine microbiota, which will help restore the balance of the microbiota, regenerate the integrity of the epithelial communities, and stimulate the immune function of the intestinal mucosa. And how will they do this? By activating natural killer cells, macrophages, but not T and B cells. They will acidify the intestinal environment, but for that, they need to survive, a survival that is important. We need them to reach the large intestine. That is why when we always give a probiotic, we try to give it with food in order to stimulate that buffering effect of the food regarding the acidic secretions, and the ability to remain alive over time diminishes. So that has a close relationship with time, which we can later use to give a probiotic as treatment. We mentioned within the immune functions, and when we later talked about homeostasis, that dysbiosis is linked to an alteration in the metabolic performance of the microbiota, and in this case, this is expressed through the decrease in the production of short-chain fatty acids. There are several, but today we will focus on butyrate for its role as an anti-inflammatory mediator within the mucosal immune system. This short-chain fatty acid will come from the action of saccharolytic microbiota, Bifidobacterium adolescentes, and Ruminococcus on dietary fiber, especially resistant starch, both in the ascending colon and in the cecum. There is a phenomenon here of cross-feeding, we won't get into it, but how these muconutritive microbiota, Quermansia mutinifila, and Bacteroides fragilis, in conjunction with the saccharolytic microbiota, will both participate in the synthesis and maintenance of this short-chain fatty acid. We mentioned that these main butyrate-producing bacteria are the ones we discussed, Bifidobacterium, and the muconutritive microbiota, 2001, which will come from the action on prebiotic fiber that can come from inulin. But that especially plays an important role is resistant starch that we can obtain from foods such as you know, by cooking and refrigerating rice or cooking, potatoes, cassava, or green plantains. The truth is that butyrate has many functions, all important, but if we focus on those that interest us today, which are the functions that will have an anti-inflammatory effect, we will say that it stabilizes pH, helps regenerate the mucus layer, becomes an important nutrient for colonocytes, reinforces resistance to colonization by pathogens, and modulates the inflammatory response of the intestinal wall. And all this takes place because there is a specific receptor for butyrate, which is the GPR receptor. The binding to these receptors will initiate a series of activities carried out by butyrate, helping us maintain that anti-inflammatory capacity within the intestine from producing lymphocytes that produce interleukin 10 to inhibiting histone acetylases, macrophages, inhibiting the production of pro-inflammatory substances like tumor necrosis factor alpha, etc. And all this takes place synergistically with vitamin D, my dear and beloved vitamin D, which I believe is becoming more cherished and appreciated by everyone. If I have a diet low in fiber, it will decrease the synthesis of short-chain fatty acids. It will reduce the signaling of the GPR receptors. And also the GPR43, which is perhaps why I only mentioned it. And that will block the control mechanisms of inflammation by altering the production of interleukin 18, which will result in inflammation, and vitamin D. I will try to speed up as I still have a bit left and I get lost talking, and in the end, time catches up with us. Is vitamin D necessary? Why? Because it will allow for a proper interaction between the host and the microbiota. It will also participate in the integrity of the intestinal barrier. It has a protective effect. And of course, we all know the important role it plays in the immune response. And in this case, we are talking about both the innate immune response and the adaptive one. What are pro-inflammatory mediators? These are the ones that will help us perpetuate this inflammation that our mucosa suffers, and this inflammation, well, they are mediators that are formed, which come from the action of the proteolytic microbiota 2009 when it is in excess. And this exaggerated protein catabolism will lead to the formation, on one hand, of biogenic amines, and on the other hand, of ammonia. Both occur mainly in the descending colon. In the case of amines, these will form after carboxylation and amination reactions that will lead us to form branched chain fatty acids that tend to functionally overload the liver and ammonia. And then the biogenic amines that you have surely heard of at some point, tyramine, histamine, putrescine, Amines that have a vasoactive role and in this sense are pro-inflammatory and are certainly involved with other processes, for example, with carcinogenesis, with an increased risk of inflammatory bowel disease, with an increased risk of inflammatory bowel diseases. On the other hand, we have ammonia. Ammonia, which is also a result of that pathogenic proteolytic overgrowth and which is irritating. And our body, of course, also has the wise way of trying to get rid of it, either by excreting it, converting it into ammonium, giving it a proton, an H, or by entering the urea cycle. But this ultimately overloads our liver in some way and will lead to a stage of silent chronic inflammation that will worsen this winter scenario.